Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Um, Good morning, everyone. Today is December 13th. This is the Faith and Function class. We are recording this class. It will show up on YouTube. Um, this is the last Faith and Function class of the year. We will start again on January 10th, probably with Mitzi Minor. Um, are there announcements that we should know about? Okay, they did tell us that the Looking Inward Moving Forward class, which is the other class that meets at the same time, they're doing the second half of that Idlewild racial roadmap thing that we had the adult forum on. They're doing the second half of that today, and so that will be recorded. But then they also repeat the class Wednesday night. So if you wanted to check in on that, you can do that without leaving today. Um, are there joys or concerns that we should know about? Okay, I have one from Rick, who is not with us today. He is in New York because his son-in-law was in the hospital, but was going to be discharged by Wednesday. So they were going to help their daughter take care of him and the baby. Um, and then also both of his parents were diagnosed with COVID. So we have many occasions to pray for Rick and his family. Is there anything else? All right, let's go ahead and pray. Holy God, as we read from your word today, teach us how we might better be your disciples and follow in your ways. Um, we ask for your blessings on all those who are struggling with health, and all those people who are suffering from COVID-19. We especially ask for your blessings upon Rick and his family, his daughter and son-in-law and granddaughter, and for his parents. Uh, we thank you for all the gifts that you've given us and for the wonderful gift of your son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray, amen. All right, Jim, close us out. Tell us everything we need to know for the rest of the year.
All right, we'll try to do that. We'll probably finish a little early today, actually, because there's just not that much more to say. Um, we've talked about uh, some of these key images, as I refer to them, images or metaphors or metaphorical images um, about discipleship. And I've stressed that the overarching image is following Jesus. Jesus is called to follow me, which implies an imitation of a serious kind, to do as Jesus did, um, to carry the teaching of Jesus not only in word but in deed and in attitude. And the other images or the other instructions that we get either from Jesus or from the other New Testament writers um, more or less emphasize that in different ways. Um, and we might think of it something along the lines of a jewel with different facets. And you can look and admire the jewel from a different angle, and depending on the particular facet, gives you a certain or a nuanced appreciation or yeah, for the jewel in that sense. And I would say that these different images about discipleship give us a nuanced understanding of what that means, so that while we can have images such as to take up the cross, which is really a dark image. I mean, we don't necessarily think of it that way, but to take up your cross is to take up the means of execution, to execute the self for the sake of following Jesus. Um, that's pretty heavy. Uh, I've quoted more than once the Dietrich Bonhoeffer's succinct statement: when Jesus calls a person, he bids him come and die. Um, Well, yeah, but that's heavy to when we think of it. When we think about it, Paul's use of that is the theological word mortification, to put to death those things within us that would war against or to keep us from being good disciples or proper disciples. So we are to put to death envy and impurity and selfishness and uh, wrong attitudes and anger and the like. Um, and he speaks specifically of those in his letters, particularly Romans and Ephesians and Colossians. Um, what it is to image Christ or to have uh, uh, dwelling within us and developing us into the kind of persons we're meant to be is nothing less than imaging Christ. And that comes because, as, as Paul puts it, we have both died with him in his death and we have been raised with him for new life in the Spirit of Christ, so that we are to live in his likeness and to live by his likeness. Uh, but then Paul can use the image, as we saw, I believe it was last time, and we looked at it the week before, the image of the soldier, and he draws upon the armor, the panoply of the soldier, all of which is defensive equipment. I mean, you look at Ephesians 6:12 and following, but the one offensive weapon is that of the Word of God, meaning the gospel. That we go forth into the world, living our lives with the message and I would add the message and the manner of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to, the last image that I want us to consider is the athletic image. Not one that is used very much in the New Testament, but one that, if I recall correctly, was preached a couple of 3 weeks, or maybe it was more than that, back. And it's the image of running the race, which we have in Hebrews chapter 12. But before we look at that, I want to refer to two other places. They're the only other places I know of where something of an athletic image is used. The first of these is in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. If you want to turn there, 1 Timothy 4, verse 8. Paul, writing to young Timothy, says, this is in verse 7, halfway through the verse, he says, train yourself in godliness. That's the very positive with the emphasis. And then verse 8, for while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Well, that's not a exactly wholehearted encouragement to physical exercise, but it is something of that. For while bodily training is of some value, and the only reason I can think of that Paul would use that is because it was perhaps something that Timothy did. That we need to remember that if we think that our present time, and maybe not this immediate present time because of COVID, is dominated by athletics, well, the ancient world had a good deal of athletics as well. There were the Corinthian Games and there were the Olympian Games, and they were all around as regular, sometimes yearly or quarterly or every 4 years events, so that they were very much part of the culture, is what I'm trying to say. And so whether it is Timothy himself who maybe ran or or engaged in some other athletic activity, Paul at least comments on it, says, while it is of some value, he goes on to what he really wants to emphasize, which is the practice of godliness, which, as he says, holds promise, so that it is beneficial not only for the present life, the way we live now, but for the life to come as well. And then he goes on to say, the saying is sure and worthy of full acceptance. For to this end we toil and strive, because we have our hopes set on the living God, who is the Savior of all, especially those who believe. So that's the first mention of athletics that I will draw to your attention. The second is back in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And this is more of using an athletic image as a metaphor for discipline. 1 Corinthians 9 at verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners compete, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Well, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I pommel my body and subdue it, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So here is a bit more fully the image of training, athletic training, as a kind of discipline to which one can compare the discipline of the Christian life, the Christian of following Christ, of being a disciple. And I think it's interesting, the wording that Paul uses shows that he is at least an observer, or has been an observer of certain athletics in the world. As he speaks, verse 25, every athlete exercises self-control. Well, this speaks to training that is not only physical, but also what kind of food you eat, your sleep, those sorts of things. I mean, the same things that are much done in the present time athletically were done in the ancient world as well. And then even a little bit more vividly, verse 26, I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I pommel my body and subdue it. Here Paul is kind of mixing his metaphor, that is to say that there's a certain discipline, yes, that he applies to his body, but more so he means his whole self. That indeed living the Christian life involves a certain amount of discipline, of commitment. And then he, as we see, he begins that with the image of the race. And if you go to Greece or Turkey to this day, many of the, or at least some of the ancient athletic stadiums, I mean ancient, going back to 2,000 years ago, are still there, and the blocks that runners used that they put their feet against are still there. I had the fortune of being with students in certain places like that, and of course we would line the students up to do this, and of course we would always read this verse. But it is a very positive image that Paul gives here about discipline and using the athletic world as a background for it. Anybody want to comment or add anything to that?
I have a question. It's always bothered me in verse 24. Yeah, I guess mostly verse 24, where it says, "But only one gets the prize, run in such a way as to get the prize, and that it's focusing on a one and kind of a competitive against other people. And I may just be taking the analogy too far, but what do you think about that?
I think he's saying if you run a race, you're committed, you commit to win. So I think that's the punch of it. You want to do the best you can is it would be another way of saying it. So as a Christian person, don't be uh, lackadaisical about your discipline, but be committed as though you wanted to win the race. And
The competitive part is taking the analogy a little too far.
uh, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's the commitment that I think he's emphasizing more than the idea that. I mean, you all, he's mixing a metaphor here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and he's sort of stuck in his analogy because in the ancient races, they only gave a prize to the person that won. There wasn't like silver or bronze or anything. So he's sort of stuck with that, and then it's like, so go for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Commit as though you're going for the whole thing. All right. So there's that. So then the third place is the one that we've mentioned, and I think, as I say, was preached not too long ago, and that's Hebrews chapter 12. So after you get through all the Pauline epistles, you come to Hebrews. You ever wonder, the arrangement of the books in the New Testament is you have two groups. You have Paul's letters, and then you have the rest, the others. But both groups are arranged according to length. So Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then the shorter books down through Philemon. And then Hebrews, the longest of these other letters, then James, and then 1st and 2nd Peter, 1, 2, 3 John, Jude, and that's how they're arranged. And that's just the way the ancient church arranged them. So that's the rhyme or reason to it. All right, so Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So here the image, of course, is running the race. And in looking at this, when I was working on this primarily on Friday, excuse me, 10 o'clock. I was putting my thoughts together, and then yesterday I just happened to turn to something that I had not turned to yet, and it was one of these things where this is much better than anything I've come up with, and it's so succinct that I think I'll just go with this because it's really good. And it happens to be someone that probably some of you all are familiar with, but it's William Barclay, who was, if you don't know, William Barclay was a professor of New Testament at the Divinity School at Glasgow in Scotland. And he wrote a whole series of New Testament commentaries back in the 1960s and 70s, and then some years later completely revised them, that is, brought them up to date. And looking at his treatment of these verses is just really wonderfully succinct. So, I'm just going to read from him slowly, but he brings out the points of this, I think, very, very well. So I'm not going to read everything that he wrote here, but 5 things that he brings out of, 5 observations that he brings out of this image of running the race. In fact, he says as he begins, he says, "This is one of the great moving passages of the New Testament, and in it, the writer has given us a well-nigh perfect summary of the Christian life." And you can decide whether he has or not, but I think it's certainly pretty good. So here's the first point. He says, 1, in the Christian life, we have a goal, G-O-A-L, a goal. The Christian is not an unconcerned stroller along the byways of life. He is a wayfarer on the high road. He is not a tourist who returns each night to the place from which he starts. He is a pilgrim who is forever on the way. The goal is nothing less than the likeness of Christ. And as soon as I read that, I said, this is really good. The goal, that is the goal of our lives, is not going somewhere, as it were going to heaven. That's not the goal. The goal is likeness to Christ. The Christian life is going somewhere, and what it is, and it would be well if at each day's ending we are to ask, am I any further on? Meaning any further on in the likeness to Christ. So that's the first thing. 1, our goal, likeness to Christ. Here's the second thing. In the Christian life, we have an inspiration. An inspiration. We have the thought of an unseen cloud of witnesses in these verses. And they are witnesses in a double sense, for they have witnessed their own confession to Christ, and they are now witnesses of our performance. The Christian is like a runner in some crowded stadium, and as he presses on, the crowd looks down, and the crowd looking down are those who have already won the crown. It is the very essence of the Christian life that it is lived in the gaze of the heroes of the faith who have lived, suffered, and died in their day and generation. How can one avoid the struggle for greatness with an audience like that looking down upon him? Now that's quite a description if you think about it. I think that, well, at least for me, I'll just speak for me, that about the only time I think about the communion of saints is at communion, is that when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, because that often is mentioned in the liturgy as we gather at the table. But we do well to remember the communion of saints, certainly when we pray for others, but in that larger sense of those who have already, as it were, run the race and are looking down upon us who are still running. And I won't read Barclay has a little section here where he goes on and he talks about the inspiration that one draws from others. When you know that you're in certain people's presence, you want to do better. You want to do better for them, not merely for yourself, but you want to do better for them. And so I think that's a really good point. This is part of the inspiration that we have of those who have run the race. And maybe we think of family members. Maybe we are thinking of people that are in suffering right now. Or maybe we can take inspiration from other Christians about whom we read and about how they live their lives. So that's the second thing. We have an inspiration. The third is, in the Christian life, we have a means. That means is steadfast endurance. It is a determination, unhurrying, and yet undelaying, which steadily goes on and refuses to be deflected. I like that. It is a determination, unhurrying, and yet undelaying, which goes steadily on and refuses to be deflected. Obstacles do not daunt it, and discouragements do not take its hope away. It is the steadfast endurance which carries on until the end. It gets there. So we have a means, the endurance. Fourth thing, in the Christian life, we have an example. That example is Jesus himself. For the goal that was set before him, he endured all things. To win it meant the way of the cross. The writer to the Hebrews has a flash of insight, despising the shame, he says. Jesus was sensitive. Never had any person so sensitive a heart. The cross was a humiliating thing. It was for criminals, for those whom society regarded as the dregs of humanity. And yet he accepted it. St. Philip of Neri bids us, quote, to despise the world, to despise ourselves, and to despise the fact that we are despised, unquote. If Jesus could endure like that, so also we are called. So we have the example. And then fifth, and then this is very Pauline, although it's in Hebrews here, but that makes sense. Fifth thing, in the Christian life, we have a presence, the presence of Jesus. He is at once the goal of our journey and the companion of our way. At once the one whom we go to meet and the one with whom we travel. The wonder of the Christian life is that we press on, surrounded by the saints, oblivious to everything but the glory of the goal, and forever in the company of him who has already made the journey and reached the goal, and who waits to welcome us when we reach the end. In the Christian life, we have a presence, Jesus himself. Well, I think that's about as good an exposition of that metaphor, that image, or as succinct a good definition as I can find anyway. So, anybody want to comment?
I would like to.
Yes, please.
I don't see a lot in this that reiterates what Jesus said. The most important is to love God. The second is to love your neighbor. And I see myriad examples of this in the healthcare workers who are giving their lives to help others. That they are what I think Jesus meant. You are to look out for those who are having a hard time. You're to help them. And these healthcare workers are dying,
Yep.
To help people, especially those in low income situations. And I think I would wish that Paul would have spent more time talking about how do you live. I mean, you can just live to love Jesus, mystically or one way or another, but you should work to love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we have the example in our community of, people who are doing that.
Yeah, I mean, right now, those are the people that are most certainly on the front lines. Yeah, they certainly are. Absolutely. Anybody else?
Yeah, Claire
Claire.
here. I was glad that you de-emphasized the life after death. I think that is overemphasized in some denominations. I grew up in one that did that, and that's so unimportant to me. But I'm with Mena on what we can do here and now
Mm-hmm.
counts. I don't care about later.
Yeah, the running the race is a very present kind of metaphor. I mean, it is it's a reminder. I mean, I'm not overly athletic, and I hate running, frankly. I wish Paul had used the image of biking the Christian life, but but it is a very present and powerful image. Yeah, out the here and now. Anybody else? All right. I want to finish relatively quickly, and that is with a comparison, and it's just that, a comparison of the way in which discipleship is emphasized in the four Gospels. That is to say that when you read each of the four Gospels, obviously being a disciple is either overtly expressed or it is certainly implicit in much of what is said and in each gospel as a whole. And yet there is, as I would say, there is something of a nuance that is expressed, a different facet of discipleship, of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. That is, shall we say, dominant, not the only thing that is expressed, but dominant in each of the Gospels. And so this is just kind of a comparison. First of all, and I'll begin with Mark because that's the shortest of the Gospels. Mark's Gospel I call the Gospel of the saving servant, meaning Jesus is the saving servant. And discipleship in Mark's Gospel is more implied than it is overtly expressed, except in a couple of places where it is most certainly overtly expressed. But if the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of the saving servant, then discipleship is to be a servant of the saving servant. And in Mark's Gospel, the emphasis of the suffering of Jesus is quite apparent, particularly when you get halfway through the Gospel and Peter confesses who Jesus is as Messiah, and Jesus says the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem where he will be rejected and put to death and in 3 days rise again. And Peter doesn't like that idea of the Messiah dying. It made no sense to him, and he says, no, let's not do that. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, for your thoughts are not God's thoughts. That is, Peter doesn't understand what the Messiah has come to do and how he has come to be Messiah. And then later on, shortly thereafter, in fact, it's in the next chapter that Jesus says, if you would follow me, you must take up your cross and follow me. And also in that chapter is where you have James and John come along and say, when you come into your kingdom, that is, when your rule begins, make us your number 1 and 2 men on either side of you. And of course, in Mark's Gospel, the first people that are on either side of Jesus as Jesus comes into his reign is at his crucifixion. There, as the Son of God suffers, as the Roman soldier said, truly this man was the Son of God, and he was saying far more than he understood, more than he knew. But who is on Jesus's right and left but 2 criminals? And the implication is what Jesus has said earlier, that if you would follow me, you may well end up just as I am. And so in Mark's gospel, the disciples struggle with understanding who Jesus is. In fact, if you read Mark's gospel straight through, you'll see that, when Jesus asks, do you understand? And Mark just says, no, they don't understand. No, they don't get it. Um, and in fact, they don't get it until the end when uh, uh, when Jesus dies, and then they're beginning to put it together. But the implication then, in terms of the nuance of meaning of the discipleship in Mark's gospel, is that of suffering for the sake of the servant, suffering for the sake of others. And that's a nuance that is hard for us because we really don't suffer for our faith. That is, we don't suffer in any real tangible sense. We certainly don't suffer in a physical sense. We may suffer in other ways for various things, and our faith may go through difficulties and challenges from other ways, but it's not from the kind of suffering that Mark was writing to the kind of suffering the people were going through to whom Mark was writing, which was actual physical and terrible persecution at the time. Be that as it may, it is a call to suffer for Jesus as need be. And that is I would say, a dominant aspect of Mark's gospel, and it speaks especially to people in the world and at times when people are literally suffering for their faith. Matthew's gospel is more quite overt in the meaning of discipleship. For to be a disciple of Jesus is not only to follow him, but to make disciples of others. And these are the last words that Jesus says. Go into all the world. The very last thing that Jesus says to the apostles, to the disciples, go into all the world and make disciples. That in Matthew's gospel, as it were, disciples have an agenda. And that agenda is to make disciples of others, to teach others the meaning of Jesus. And in Matthew's gospel, the disciples come off much better in Matthew's gospel than they do in Mark's gospel. He's much kinder to them as he writes about them. But in Matthew's gospel, you are confronted. I mean, if you read Mark's gospel and then you read Matthew's gospel, you're immediately confronted with all this teaching of Jesus. There's so much more of what Jesus said and taught. Think of the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. But you have five large blocks of Jesus' teaching. Matthew 25 with the sheep and the goats and all of that. Feeding the hungry, visiting those in prison, clothing the naked, are aspects of being a disciple. And then, as I say, the end of Matthew's gospel closes with the commission to make disciples of others. So there's a very strong teaching dimension, an agenda aspect with Matthew's gospel. And if you want to put it succinctly, it is that in Matthew's gospel, to be a disciple is to be a commissioner of Jesus in the world, and to teach what he taught, and not merely with words, certainly, but also with deeds. In Luke's disciples, or the implication of what it means to be a disciple in Luke's gospel, is to become a follower of the way of Jesus. It took at least about 20 years, maybe 15 or 20 years, before the term Christian was coined about the followers of Jesus. And that was coined up in Antioch in Syria. But in the earliest years, the Christians, or were simply called followers of the way. And they took that from the claim of Jesus himself, I am the way. Um, and uh, and so that's what they were. They were followers of the way. And when you read Luke's gospel, you run into much of the teaching that you have in Matthew's gospel. In fact, most of the Sermon on the Mount is in Luke's gospel, but it's spread out. It's not all together like you have in Matthew's gospel. The Lord's Prayer, a slightly shorter version of it, and the Beatitudes, among others, are in Luke's gospel, but they're spread out, and they're largely spread out among the stories of Jesus, the encounters of Jesus has with people. And if in Matthew's gospel you run very much into the teaching of Jesus, which you certainly do, in Luke's gospel you run into the people that Jesus dealt with. It's in Luke's gospel that you meet the prodigal son. It's in Luke's gospel you meet the Good Samaritan, in his stories. It's in Luke's gospel you meet all these people that we're familiar with in the Jesus stories. And even though they may be in other places, that is in the other gospels, it's usually the way Luke has told it to us that we remember them. Here we are in Advent. It's only Luke that tells us about, of course, the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. It's only Luke that tells us about Simeon and Elizabeth and all of these people. And so, if you will, if Luke's implication, and it becomes overt in his second volume, the book of Acts, is that to be a follower of Jesus is to be a follower of the way Jesus lived and taught. To be a follower of the way that he lived. That is, it's not just a matter of saying the things that Jesus said, but it's embodying those things in our attitudes in dealing with people, in our living out, in our traveling the way, in our traveling day by day with Jesus, running the race, that we really are doing that. And so that would be, I would say, the particular dominant nuance that you have in Luke. And it certainly does, as with both Matthew and Mark, involve counting the cost. And what does counting the cost mean? Well, that means not only simply denying oneself, as one may need to, but it means reaching out to others. Just as Mena was pointing out, just as we think about these healthcare workers and doctors and others who are putting themselves on the line daily and putting their own health and their own lives at risk, how do we do that? And that is a challenge for us always. But that's what counting the cost is about as well, to be a follower of Jesus, to be a follower of his agenda and his way. And then finally, in John, what is it to be a disciple for John? Well, certainly, first and foremost, to be a disciple is to be a believer. To those whom believed in his name, John says in the prologue, he gave the power to become the children of God. The end of the gospel, down to John chapter 20, these things Jesus did many other things that showed he was the Messiah. Jesus did many other miracles, many other mighty acts. But these things are written, John says, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and in believing have life in his name. In his name. So to be a follower of Jesus is to believe in him, but it is also, and this is certainly the emphasis that you have not only in the gospel, but even more explicitly in the first letter of John, to practice love. How are Christians distinguished? It is by their love of one another. If you would love me, if you would be my disciples, is what John is saying, you will love like Jesus. How can you say you love God whom you have not seen if you despise your brother who you have seen? The First John letter of First John. So in John, the emphasis is love, to love like Jesus, to care like Jesus. This is my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit and show that you are disciples, Jesus says in chapter 15, which is the chapter where he speaks of, I am the vine and you are the branches. That organic idea that we are nothing apart from Jesus, and that we have life that runs through our veins, as it were, like the sap in a tree, or the life-giving water in a plant. So Jesus is the water. Of course, that's an image Jesus uses himself in John. I am the living water. But that same idea that we are the branches of Jesus to show him forth in the world. So, to believe and to love as Jesus, I would say, is the particular nuance of discipleship in John's gospel. And with that, I am done, at least with the study for the moment. But any questions or further comments as our time's about up?
Thank you, Jim. Your knowledge and straightforward way of teaching about the Bible is very meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. McClanahan will return in the spring around Easter. I think you've got I think we've got you for like Palm Sunday, and then there's no class on Easter, and then for a brief series after.
Probably the month of April.
Yeah.
Run the race, folks. Run the race.
Stay well, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. See you guys in January.
God bless. Thank you all. Keep safe.